Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking into something called deep work.
Deep work.
We're going to be using Cal Newport's book, Deep Work, Rules for Focused Success in a Distracted World.
Okay.
Have you read this one?
Oh, yeah, I love that book.
So for our listeners out there who haven't read it, we're going to kind of give our take on it.
Okay.
But before we dive into the book itself, I think it's helpful to kind of set the stage of why this concept of deep work is even important.
Right.
So, we live in this world today of constant distraction,
Yeah.
short attention spans.
The attention economy.
The attention economy.
Yeah.
So in that context, why is this idea of deep work even relevant or important at all?
Well, I mean, in some ways, it's never been more important,
Right.
because the things that are most valuable right now are the things that are hardest to automate.
Right.
So, the things that are easy to automate,
Yeah.
they're becoming less and less valuable. They're becoming more and more commoditized. And so the things that are most valuable are the things that, involve things like creativity and insight and strategy.
Right.
And those are the things that require you to work deeply.
Right.
And so, it's kind of this paradox where, the world is moving in this direction of more distraction, shorter attention spans.
Yeah.
The sort of the commoditization of everything except for the thing that is really driving value creation, which is deep work.
Right.
And so I think it's more important now than ever to be able to work deeply.
It is interesting that, that it is so valuable,
Yeah.
yet it seems like so few people can actually do it.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes it so valuable.
Right.
The fact that it's so rare and that it's so hard to do
Yeah.
is precisely what makes it so valuable.
Okay, so let's dive into the book now a little bit.
Yeah.
Newport talks about 3 trends
Okay.
in the business world that kind of work against this idea of deep work.
Yeah.
So what are those 3 trends?
Well, the first is, this push for constant connectivity.
Okay.
The always-on culture
Right.
that, expects us to be reachable at all times.
Yeah.
You know?
Like we're never allowed to disconnect.
Yeah. Even when we're not working.
Yeah.
There's this expectation that we're still checking email, we're still, responding to Slack messages.
Right.
So, that's definitely one trend.
Okay, so constant connectivity.
Constant connectivity.
What's the second one?
The second is, this obsession with rapid communication.
Okay.
So, emails, text messages, instant messages,
Right.
all these things.
Like we just value speed over everything else.
Yeah, we think that by, responding quickly, we're being productive. But a lot of times, that rapid communication is actually preventing us from doing the deep work that's really necessary to produce something valuable.
Interesting.
So it's like we're mistaking activity for productivity.
Right.
We're mistaking busyness for real value creation.
Right. And the third trend.
The third trend is, this pressure to have an active social media presence.
Okay.
And I think this is something that affects a lot of people, whether they're, entrepreneurs or just, knowledge workers in general.
Right.
There's this pressure to be constantly, posting on Twitter, posting on Facebook, posting on Instagram.
Right.
And it's another form of this, distraction and busyness is preventing us from doing deep work.
Right. So these 3 trends, they all seem very prevalent in the workplace today.
And it's only getting worse.
Right. So how do we push back against that? How do we actually make deep work a priority
Yeah, that's a great question.
when all these forces are kind of working against us?
And that's really what we're going to get into in the rest of this deep dive.
Right.
Talking about, what are some practical strategies
Yeah.
for overcoming these trends?
Right. And for actually carving out time for deep work in our lives. But before we do that, I want to kind of go back to this idea that you mentioned earlier about how deep work is so valuable because it's rare.
Yeah.
Why is that? Why is it so hard? It's not like it requires any special equipment or, it's not physically demanding. So
Okay.
what makes it so difficult?
Well, I think part of it is that it's hard work.
Okay.
It's mentally demanding.
Right.
It requires focus. It requires concentration.
Right.
And, in a world where we're constantly being distracted,
Right.
it's very easy to just give in to those distractions.
Sure.
And, to kind of go for the easy thing.
Like checking your email for the 50th time today.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think, part of it is just that it's hard work and it's easier to avoid hard work.
Right.
But I think there's also something deeper going on. I think,
Okay.
in a world where we're so focused on being busy,
Yeah.
on responding quickly, on having an active social media presence.
Yep.
I think we've lost sight of the value of deep work.
Okay.
We don't necessarily know how to measure it.
Right.
We don't necessarily know how to quantify it.
Yeah, it's harder to quantify deep work
Exactly.
than it is to quantify, how many emails you responded to,
Or
or
or how many meetings you attended.
right.
Those things are easy to quantify.
Right.
But how do you quantify, an insight that you had
Yeah.
or a breakthrough that you made?
Right.
You know, those things are much harder to quantify.
Hard to measure that. Right.
And so I think, in a world where we're so obsessed with metrics
Right.
and
Yeah.
quantifying everything,
Yeah.
deep work kind of gets lost in the shuffle
Right.
because it's not as easily quantifiable as some of these other things.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
So it's not just that it's hard, it's also that it's hard to prove.
It's hard to prove.
Yeah.
And I think that's why you see so many people, kind of defaulting to busyness.
Right.
Because busyness is easy to prove.
Right.
You can point to your calendar and say, look at all these meetings I attended.
Right. Look how busy I am.
Yeah, look at all these emails I responded to.
Must be important.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
But, you can't necessarily point to, the insights that you had.
Right.
Or the breakthroughs that you made
Right.
as easily.
That's a really good point.
So I think that's part of the challenge.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So we've got these three trends that are kind of working against deep work.
Right.
And then we've got this challenge of it's hard to do.
Yeah.
And it's hard to prove.
Yeah.
So with all of that working against us,
Right.
what hope do we have?
Well, that's what we're going to talk about in the rest of this deep dive.
Okay, good.
And then we're going to talk about some strategies for overcoming these challenges.
All right, so for everybody listening, we're going to come back in part 2 of this deep dive, and we're going to actually talk about, how do we make time and space for deep work
Right.
in our lives?
Sounds good. Welcome back to our deep dive on deep work.
So in part 1, we talked about the importance of deep work and
Mhm.
why it's so difficult to do in today's world.
Okay.
So now let's talk about how we actually make time and space for deep work in our lives.
Well,
Because, it's easy to say, deep work is important.
Yeah.
I should do more of it.
right.
But then life gets in the way and,
Yeah.
distractions happen and,
Yeah.
it's hard to actually follow through.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that Newport talks about in the book is that, you need to have a strategy
Okay.
for deep work.
So what does that look like? Like, what's an example of a strategy?
Well, one of the things he talks about is, having rituals
Okay.
for deep work.
What do you mean by rituals?
So, like a specific set of things that you do
Okay.
to kind of get yourself into that deep work state.
Right.
So, for example, maybe you always work in the same place.
Okay.
Maybe you always, put on the same music. Maybe you always, have a cup of coffee.
So it's like a routine.
Yeah, it's routine. It's a ritual
Okay.
that kind of signals to your brain like, okay, it's time to focus now.
Right.
It's time to go deep.
Interesting.
And, these rituals can be anything you want.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be, anything fancy or complicated.
Right.
It's just whatever works for you
Okay.
to kind of get you into that state of mind.
I see.
So that's one strategy.
Okay. So rituals.
Ritual.
What's another strategy?
Another strategy is to schedule deep work blocks.
Okay.
So, actually block out time in your calendar
Right.
for deep work.
Like you would for a meeting.
Exactly.
Okay.
And, this might sound obvious, but it's actually really important.
Yeah.
Because if you don't schedule it,
It's not going to happen.
it's not going to happen.
Right.
It's just going to get filled up with other things.
Right. All those other distractions.
Exactly.
Yeah. All those meetings and emails.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, actually block out the time
Okay.
and treat it like any other important appointment.
So, we've talked about scheduling deep work blocks. We've talked about rituals.
Right.
What are some other strategies for making this happen?
Well, another thing you can do is to try to eliminate distractions
Okay.
as much as possible.
Easier said than done.
Easier said than done, I know.
Yeah.
But, there are things you can do.
Okay.
Like turn off your phone.
Great.
Or put it in airplane mode.
Right.
Close your email.
Right.
Close your browser.
Shut off Slack.
Shut off Slack. Yeah.
Like all the things that are constantly
Yeah.
blowing up at us.
Yeah. All the things that are constantly vying for our attention,
Yeah.
just eliminate those.
So it's about creating space
Creating space.
for focus.
Creating space for focus. Exactly.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense.
And it might sound kind of extreme,
Okay.
but if you're really serious about deep work,
Right.
you need to take it seriously,
Right.
and you need to create the space for it.
And I imagine that looks different for different people.
Absolutely.
Like what works for one person might not work for another.
Right.
So it's really about kind of experimenting
Experiment
and finding what works for you.
finding what works for you. Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So I think those are some of the key strategies.
Okay, so we've got rituals, we've got scheduling deep work blocks, we've
Yeah.
got eliminating distractions.
Right.
I feel like we're starting to build like a toolkit here
Yeah,
for
exactly.
deep work.
Yeah, you're building your deep work toolkit.
All right, so let's keep going then. What else can we add to this toolkit?
Well, another important tool is to learn how to say no to
Yeah.
things.
So we're talking about saying no to distractions.
Well, saying no to distractions is part of it.
Yeah.
But it's also about saying no to commitments
Okay.
that are going to prevent you from doing deep work.
Right, so if you're constantly overcommitting,
Yeah.
you're never going to have the time or the energy
Exactly.
for deep work.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point.
And it can be hard to say no,
Right.
especially in a culture where we're so often rewarded for saying yes.
Right, for being busy,
Exactly.
for taking on more and more.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, it takes practice,
Right.
but it's an important skill to learn.
So learning to say no.
Learning to say no. That's right.
Anything else we can add to our toolkit?
Well, one more thing I would add is to embrace boredom.
Embrace boredom.
Embrace boredom.
Wait, how does that fit in with deep work?
Well, I think one of the reasons why deep work is so hard is that we're just not used to being bored anymore.
Right.
We're constantly stimulated.
Always have our phones.
We always have our phones. We always have, something to entertain us.
Netflix.
Netflix, yeah.
Video games.
Video games,
Yeah.
whatever.
Right.
And so, we've lost the ability to just sit with our own thoughts
Right.
and be bored.
Okay.
And so I think one of the things that we need to do if we want to be able to do deep work is to actually relearn how to be bored.
So you're saying that boredom is like a muscle
Yeah, it's like a muscle
that we need to exercise.
that we need to exercise.
Okay, that's an interesting concept.
Yeah, and it's not easy.
Right.
It's not comfortable to be bored,
Right.
but it's important.
Because it helps us build our ability to focus
Exactly.
when we do need to focus.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, don't be afraid to be bored.
So we've got rituals, scheduling deep work blocks, eliminating distractions, learning to say no, and embracing boredom.
That's a pretty good toolkit.
I think we're ready to go deep.
I think so too.
Welcome back to our deep dive on deep work.
We've talked about a lot of kind of tactical strategies.
Right, we built a whole toolkit.
A whole toolkit, yeah, for implementing deep work. But I think it's important to also talk about kind of the mindset
Okay.
that you need to have.
Okay, so we've got the tools. Now we need like the
right mindset.
right mindset to use them.
Exactly.
Okay, what does that mindset look like?
Well, one of the most important things is to believe that deep work is valuable,
Okay.
And I think a lot of people intellectually understand that,
All right.
but they don't really believe it in their gut.
So it's one thing to know it, it's another thing to actually like
I actually believe it.
Well,
believe it.
yeah.
And to live it,
Right.
because if you don't really believe that deep work is valuable,
Right.
then you're not going to make the time for it.
Right, you're not going to prioritize it.
You're not going to prioritize it. You're not going to
Yeah.
protect it.
Right.
You're going to let other things get in the way.
Yeah, all those distractions that we talked about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, you really need to have that deep belief that this is important
Yeah.
and that it's worth fighting for.
Okay, so belief in the value of deep work, that's one part of the mindset.
That's one part of the mindset. Yeah.
What else?
Another important part of the mindset is to be patient.
Okay.
Deep work is not something that you can just turn on and off like a switch.
Right.
It takes time.
It takes practice.
It takes practice. Yeah.
It's a skill
It's a skill.
to be developed.
Exactly.
Right, so patience.
Patience. Yeah.
I know.
And I think the third part of the mindset is to be willing to experiment.
Okay.
What works for one person might not work for another.
Right.
And what works for you today might not work for you tomorrow.
Okay.
So, be willing to try different things.
Okay.
Be willing to experiment.
Be willing to fail.
Be willing to fail. Yeah.
And learn from those failures.
Exactly. And keep iterating.
Keep iterating, yeah.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah, so I think those are kind of the three key parts of the mindset.
Belief, patience, and experimentation.
I think that's a great way to kind of wrap up this deep dive.
Yeah.
We've talked about why deep work is important. We've talked about the challenges that we face in doing deep work.
Right.
We've talked about some strategies for overcoming those challenges.
Right.
And we've talked about the mindset that we need to have
Yeah.
to make it all happen.
So I think we're well equipped now to go out and do some deep work.
I think so too. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
I hope everybody listening has found it valuable.
Me too.